Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we are going to talk about Anton Mesmer. Uh, Franz Anton Mesmer was a doctor in the 18th century. I believe he was Austrian, and he doesn't get talked about much in the context of the history of Wicca or the witchcraft revival. But I think he's actually quite important, and so I kind of just want to take a few minutes today to talk about Mesmer because he's been on my mind a lot lately. Mesmer was working in the late 18th century. He published his most significant works in the 1770s, and his basic idea was that humans are animated by a vital force that is akin to magnetism in some way, and that this vital force can be manipulated in ways that can produce therapeutic effects. Mesmer was working at a time when a lot of the scientific discoveries that we now take for granted were not available to him. This includes like medical discoveries, understandings of the human body, biological theories like evolution weren't on the table yet, but also just a sophisticated understanding of electromagnetic force and what it is and how it works weren't on the table, right? Like, Nikola Tesla hadn't done any of his stuff yet. Mesmer was working in an intellectual and scientific milieu where magnets were kind of this mysterious thing that seemed to have something cool and noteworthy going on, but no one really had a strong sense of how they worked or what they could and couldn't do. So Mesmer decided to, in time-honored scientific tradition, to fuck around and find out. He had a patient whom he was treating for hysteria, and right, we all know that can mean so many different things, but he had a patient he was treating for some kind of mental illness, and decided to try to treat her with magnetism. And he, in a way that, in hindsight, was grossly irresponsible, he had her swallow a solution that contained small iron filings dissolved up. So he had her ingest a whole bunch of iron, and then he attached magnets to her body. And she described feeling kinda strange, wonder why. And from this, Mesmer sort of developed a theory that there was a magnetic current, a magnetic field of some kind in the human body, and that by bringing in more iron and applying a magnetic force to it, he had been able to manipulate that magnetic force inside of his patient's body and to unblock whatever was blocked up in a way that helped to cure her of her hysteria. And in, I want to say it was 1779, Mesmer publishes, and he publishes a document called On the Discovery of Animal Magnetism, where he hypothesized that there was this vital force, which he called animal magnetism, and that it could be used in medicine to cure people of various illnesses, ranging from hysteria to blindness to, anything else. There's some kind of life force inside of you, and you can use magnets or even just sort of the concentrated application of your own will to manipulate that life force in a way that will produce demonstrable medical results. Now, Mesmer was a hack. There's no question about that. His apparent findings have been thoroughly disproved, are not taken seriously by modern medicine, were disproved very quickly, honestly. So he starts working on animal magnetism in like 74, and by like 1778-ish, he has to flee Vienna because all of these grandiose claims he's making about being able to cure people with animal magnetism are coming up short. So very, very quickly, the mainstream medical establishment rejects Anton Mesmer's theory of animal magnetism. But it gains a foothold in certain circles. And there are sort of corners of so-called alternative medicine throughout Europe that become really interested in Mesmer's theory of animal magnetism. And these people kind of are like faith healers of a kind, except that they think of what they're doing as highly scientific. But this phenomenon spreads across Europe it becomes known as mesmerism, and then mesmerism in turn sort of eventually gives birth to modern hypnotism. And all of it comes out of this idea that there is this magnetic life force inside of people that we can manipulate. Mesmer eventually abandons the idea that actual physical magnets are necessary in the manipulation of this force, and he thinks that you can just sort of consciously and through deliberate application of your will, you can magnetically charge your body or another person's body and manipulate that current. And this gives birth to a couple of really important notions. Mesmerism becomes popular in spiritualist circles. It becomes connected with the idea of the spirit or the soul. And you get a lot of people in spiritualism who, are sort of adopting this vague electricity, magnetism type theory. Again, a lot of this is happening at a time where some of the scientific terminology that we take for granted now didn't exist. So it seems very silly nowadays to talk about human beings as like magnets. But, you know, people were looking for language with which to express this pseudo-magical, pseudo-mystical idea that there's some kind of thing going on in people that can be harnessed and directed. And again, at the time, they were really conceiving of this as a scientific process rather than a magical one. So you get this idea that there is a life force, a vitalism within people that can be directed and controlled to exert particular kinds of effects. Part of the result of this is the idea that you can generate a field by sort of people holding hands with each other and creating a larger energetic battery. You also get the idea that this animal magnetism can be directed into particular objects in order to charge them. So metals supposedly held animal magnetism quite well because obviously ferromagnetic metals hold like real magnetism well. So there was this idea that they would also hold a magical charge. But also like water. You find a lot of mesmerists talking about the idea of magnetically, by which they mean like animal magnetism, not magnetism, magnetically charging a glass of water. And there are detailed instructions for how to hold a glass of water in your left hand and make a certain number of passes over it with your right hand in order to charge it up with your animal magnetism. And this is, again, inspired by what was known about actual magnets, right? Magnets have a positive and a negative pole, and you magnetize a piece of metal by repeatedly stroking it in the same direction with something that's already magnetized in order to get all the electrons to line up in the right way. And this is kind of how people were thinking about the application of animal magnetism. So there was an idea, this originates with Mesmer, that the human body is divided into poles. So your right side is the positive pole, your left side is the negative pole. And that's why you can create a circuit by holding hands with people, but also that like you can use those two poles and make repeated passes over something while like focusing your intention in order to magnetically charge up some object or a glass of water or so on in a way that it will then have healing properties. So you would charge up a glass of water and then give it to a sick person. That sick person would drink the water and supposedly sort of ingest the vital potency that it had by virtue of having been magnetically charged. And I mean, you still see this in like woo-woo circles today, right? Like you'll see a lot of like pseudo health brands talk about like positive ions in their water, and like, ions, like any mineral water has ions in it. That's absolute nonsense. That this is like some supposedly amazing health benefit. But the language they're using is borrowed, probably not consciously, but is borrowed from this legacy of mesmerism and the idea of like a positive charge that can give water super special healing properties. Same thing if you see like Himalayan salt lamps that like advertise themselves as dispelling positive ions into the air and therefore curing your liver and fixing your acne and improving your sex life. Like, all of that is pseudoscientific nonsense, but it's pseudoscientific nonsense that's rooted in the pseudoscientific nonsense of Anton Mesmer. So why am I talking about all of this? It's because Mesmer's theories of animal magnetism, I think, are hugely influential in the development of Wicca and in the way that early Wiccans in particular thought about magic, magical power, and the way that they could do magic. So if you read through any of Gardner's writings on Wicca, Gardner is pretty circumspect when he talks about the specifics of how Wiccans do magic. That's actually one of the things that he's fairly close to chest about. But he talks in a couple of places about this idea of the power, which power. And Gardner has this idea that magical power is something latent in the body. It is something inherent as sort of a vital force within the human body. Stop me if this sounds familiar. That can then be sort of raised up through particular techniques, directed toward a particular purpose, or charged into certain kinds of objects, including like a glass of water. And Gardner does actually talk about like magically charging water. And these are like, that idea comes from somewhere. It's, I think, particularly noteworthy because Wicca introduces this idea of magical power, of raising power, as part of the practice of magic. And that's something that you don't see in a lot of occultism prior to Wicca. So if you look at like the Solomonic tradition, really any of the grimoires, or also like talismans along the lines of the Picatrix, like a lot of magic is very process-oriented. It relies on the idea that there are certain steps that you follow, there's a procedure, and if you do the right things in the right order, using the right tools that have been prepared and consecrated in the right way, you will get the result. It's not about any kind of power that is latent in the magician. It's about the process. The power is in the process. And, you know, even more than that, a lot of the time the source of power is supposed to be the spirits that you're interacting with. So you call on God or various angels, or you direct a demon or other spirit to fulfill whatever it is that you desire. And it's not that you have some kind of latent power within you that you are directing toward a goal. It's that you are kind of borrowing the power of a spirit that is able to do things that you are not. And that's a very different model from the way that Gardner talks about magic. Gardner talks about magic as something that is latent in the human body, as a force that is possessed by all living people, that we then sort of consciously raise up and direct using a specified set of techniques in order to directly achieve our result. So it's not so much about the intervention of other spirits, it's about, like, we have this life force and we are going to raise and direct that life force in a way that's going to get us the results that we want. Gardner also, I think, really importantly, again, if we're thinking about this connection to mesmerism, Gardner talks a lot about magic in psychological terms. So a lot of the magic that he discusses doing or having done is about influencing someone's subconscious. The classic example is Operation Cone of Power, when supposedly the New Forest Coven came together to do a magical working against the Nazi regime to prevent them from invading Britain. And what they did was not to erect a magical wall around Britain or to cause planes to malfunction or anything like that. They tried to implant an idea subliminally in Hitler's mind, and the idea that they tried to implant was that he could not cross the sea. They tried to convince him that he would not be successful if he crossed the sea, so he shouldn't even try. And that's, again, directly related to the way that Mesmer worked and thought and talked about this animal magnetism, this vital force, was something that could affect people. And you would, direct the vital force to other people to, cure their psychological ailments, or any kind of psychosomatic illnesses that they might have. And so when we look at early Wiccans who are talking about witch power, what witch power is and what witch power can do, they're really drawing quite heavily, I think, on Anton Mesmer's ideas of animal magnetism, both in the sense that magnetism is something latent in the body that can be consciously directed by someone who knows what they're doing, and in the ideas that animal magnetism is most effective when it is directed at another person, right? At another person who is also animally magnetic and therefore affected by it. And then there's sort of this third thing, which is a kind of a later development in mesmerism, but the idea that animal magnetism can be discharged into objects that will retain some kind of a magnetic charge. And so, yeah, this kind of latent sort of proto-hypnotism, this idea of a vital force within us that can be used to affect people subconsciously, but can also be used to kind of directly influence events in the world, is, I think, a very different approach to magic and occultism than a lot of what we had seen before. Now, that's not to say that nothing like this had ever been on the table before, because of course that's not true. And you do have lots of like folk magic that involves like very direct action in a way that doesn't require the intercession of external spirits or anything like that. But I think the theory behind it, the theoretical framework, this idea of there is a life force within us that we then sort of control and direct in this way using these particular techniques, strikes me as being deeply indebted to Anton Mesmer. Of course, Mesmer is not the only person ever to have thought this. There are a lot of people throughout history and all over the world who have had similar ideas. In particular, people love to talk about the idea of qi as sort of a life essence that you find in esoteric Taoism and other East Asian religions. Obviously, there's a kind of a very similar thing going on. Or again, if you want to talk about like prana, those are similar ideas. And obviously, like when we're talking about any one of these ideas, like thinking about the other, thinking about how other people came up with similar things, thinking about empire and how people in Britain in the 1930s would have been aware of East or South Asian, metaphysical and philosophical concepts. Like that's all relevant. And I think ideas about qi or prana or other kinds of life force are also influencing what's going on here. But I think the specific language that Gardner uses to describe a lot of magic, to my eye at least, shows a real serious debt to mesmerism and to Mesmer's idea of animal magnetism. So just wanted to talk that through. I hope you enjoyed. I am moving, so as you can see, my bookcase is gone and things are pretty empty in this room. This is probably the last video that I will film in this house, but I hope you are having a good 2024 so far, and I will catch up with you sometime soon. Bye.